Well, it's a holiday weekend for my friends and family members back in the United States. They're enjoying their long Independence Day, 4th of July weekend with fireworks and picnics and however else they wish to celebrate. But it is a difficult time to be living in the United States right now. Over the past few months, as I'm sure you've noticed, they've been wrestling with their sad history of slavery and the racism that has been born out of that continues to be a part of their society today, really continues to be a part of all of our societies today. So this morning I wanted to share with you one historic photo that sadly captures America's history of racism. Maybe you remember the story, or maybe you haven't heard it. Back in the 1950s, the United States outlawed segregation. Segregation was their practice of keeping blacks and whites separate. Separate schools, separate stores, separate barber shops, separate everything. And one of the most difficult places to integrate was the schools, especially in the southern United States. So in 1957, I'm going to show you a picture here. In 1957, these 9 black students were chosen to integrate the previously all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were known as the Little Rock 9. There's 9 of them in the picture, and their adult sponsor as well. The plan was that all 9 of them would walk into school together on that first day of school. But unfortunately, due to a communication mix-up, only one of them, Elizabeth Eckford, down in the front with the glasses on, second from the right, only Elizabeth showed up that first day of school. So alone, she walked the block from the bus stop where the bus dropped her off to the school, surrounded by this mob of angry white people. And alone, she walked up the long staircase to the front door of the school, and she stood face to face with the Alabama State soldiers who blocked her entrance to school and would not let her pass. And all alone, she turned around and walked back to the bus stop through the mob who let their prejudice and hatred pour out on young Elizabeth Eckford. And in this ugly moment, as she walked back to the bus stop, one person snapped this photo that has become famous, or maybe I should say infamous. It's an ugly moment. That's Hazel Bryant standing behind Elizabeth there. Hazel is a fellow 15-year-old student at Central High School. And Hazel was part of the mob that day, and she stepped out of the crowd behind Elizabeth, and she shouted such hateful words at Elizabeth that if I were to repeat those words today, here this morning, I might very well lose my job. But you don't need to hear the words that she used. You can see everything she's feeling and everything she's saying right there on her face. You can see hatred. You can see contempt. You can see prejudice for a whole race of people. Some of you might not know the end of that story. For those of you who don't know, those 9 students did integrate Little Rock High School that year in 1957. It was a horrible year for them, filled with physical and emotional abuse. In fact, the trauma of that experience in a lifetime of continued prejudice and poverty and family tragedies left Elizabeth Eckford a mentally and physically broken person for decades that followed. But the bravery of these 9 young people was a huge step forward towards justice, racial justice in the United States. And still going on today, right? The Black Lives Matter movement that's now going on today is forcing people all around the world, including all of us, to think about our prejudices, to think about what lives matter to us. Who do we care about? Who do we value? Who will we stand up for and defend? Who matters to us and who doesn't matter to us? That's really the question that Jesus helped us to answer over 2,000 years ago with the story that he told. This summer, we're listening to the stories that Jesus told, the parables, and our story for this morning is probably his most famous one. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. In fact, Jesus could have used Elizabeth and Hazel as star characters for his story. Let me tell you this familiar story of the Good Samaritan again, but this time with just a little bit of freedom to adapt it to the moment, to our moment today. Jesus might have told the story this way if he were here today. On one occasion, a longtime member of Mountainview Church stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus told this story. Imagine this. Hazel Bryan, the angry woman full of hatred from the picture you just saw. Imagine that Hazel Bryan was driving down the A6 on a Sunday morning, and she lost control of her car and she slammed into the concrete barrier and she rolled multiple times. Once the car came to a stop, she was able to crawl out of her vehicle and she lay there on the side of the road, desperately in need of someone to help her. It just happened to be that Pastor Tony was passing by on his way to church that morning, and he saw the accident, and he saw the woman lying helpless by the side of the road. But knowing that church was going to start soon and that he needed to preach, he changed lanes and he drove on. So too, one of Mountain View's elders, we'll just call him Edgar. Edgar, when he came to the place, he safely shifted over to the far lane and he drove on too, knowing he had responsibilities at church that morning that needed to be taken care of. But of all the people in the world, Elizabeth Eckford happened to be driving down the A6 that morning. And when she came to where Hazel was lying by the side of the road, and when she saw that it was Hazel lying there, she took pity on her. She stopped and she called an ambulance and she waited there with her, speaking words of comfort to her the whole time. In fact, she followed the ambulance to the hospital and she stayed there at the hospital by her bedside all day and all night. The next day, she had to leave. She had responsibilities she had to get to. But before she left, she hired a personal caregiver to stay with Hazel. And she left her credit card on file with the instructions to bill her for any extra expenses that this caregiver might have. So which of these three, Pastor Tony, Edgar, or Elizabeth Eckford, which of those three do you think was neighbor to Hazel? The Mountain View member replied, "The one who had mercy on her." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." It's our modern day version of the Good Samaritan. And we so often read this story of Jesus and we take away from it a nice little moralistic lesson, something like, be nice, or make sure to help others. Be kind and do things like when you're at the grocery store and you see somebody with just one item waiting to check out, let them go ahead of you. Or if your elderly neighbor has troubles walking, make sure you take out his trash for him. Or when you're traveling, when we're able to fly again, be willing to move to a middle seat on the airplane so a mother can sit next to her child. Be a good Samaritan. Be a nice, good person. Well, that's not at all the point that Jesus is making with this story. And that isn't at all the lesson that his first listeners heard when he told it. The what of this story wasn't surprising to them at all. Of course they were supposed to do good things. That's what they had been taught all their lives. That should be expected of them. That should be expected of us. What stunned them in Jesus' story was the who in the story. Who they were supposed to do these good things for. And think back to our story. Surely Jesus couldn't expect Elizabeth Eckford to be nice to Hazel Bryan, the one who had shouted such hate-filled words, the one who had hurt her for decades to come, the one who helped to break her spirit and her life. Really? Of all the people in the world that Jesus could have included in this story, of all the people in the world that Jesus could have asked Elizabeth Eckford to stop and help, would he really choose Hazel Bryan? Surely somebody else can help her. That's how radically Jesus' first century listeners would have heard the story. Because that's how much they absolutely hated Samaritans. When Jesus said that this third traveler was a Samaritan, this expert in the law that Jesus was talking to, this good, righteous, upright, religious Jew, he felt hatred simply at the sound of that word. Because that was a whole category of people that he spent his whole life trying to stay away from. He kept himself as far as possible away from every Samaritan that he knew. But let me give you a brief history and geography lesson. First, a history lesson that explains why Jews hated Samaritans. Way back in Old Testament time, in Jeremiah's time, we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before this. In Jeremiah's time, the Babylonians came and they conquered all of Israel. They held on to Israel. They kept them down for decades. And over the years, they took 3 waves of captives with them back to Babylon. They came back to Israel 3 times and raided them of people. And they always took with them the best people that were there. He took with him the smart people and the wealthy people and the useful people. So by the time they came for the 3rd time, the time when they finally burned down Jerusalem, right? By the time they came for the 3rd time and took away all the best people again, the only people that were left in Jerusalem, the only people that were left in all of Israel were the poor, the useless, the low-class people. That's who remained. And for the next 70 years, while everybody who was anybody were living off in Babylon, these poor, low-class people lived among the ruins of the nation. And they set aside many of the old traditions of Jewish worship. They set aside many of the old traditions of Jewish purity. All those patterns, all those traditions changed for those who remained. So 70 years later, when the captives returned from Babylon, the captives who were the higher class, the upright, the pure, the religious people who had kept all the traditions and all the patterns, when they returned from Babylon, these spiritually correct people found dirty, poor, spiritually impure people, and they hated them. But I can show you with geography just how much they hated them. These Samaritans were pushed out of the area of Judea, and they were given their own land called Samaria. Here's a map of Israel. You have Galilee to the north and Samaria in the middle here, and Judea in the south. And up here in Galilee is where Jesus was born and where Jesus lived, right? Here's Nazareth, the city he grew up in. And down here in Judea, this is the center of the country, Jerusalem with its capital. All the large cities were down here. And good Jewish people lived in Galilee and Judea, and the Samaritans lived in the middle, the hated Samaritans. Now, if you were in the north in Galilee and needed to get to the south, to Jerusalem, every year you were supposed to go to the temple, right? So often you needed to get from north to south or south to north. There was a road that went straight through, direct. You could walk that road. A good Jewish person, however, would skip Samaria. They would add kilometer upon kilometer to their trip. They would start here and they would go over the mountain range and cross the river to the other side of the Jordan, so they wouldn't set foot in Samaria. And then once they were past, they would cross the river again, cross the mountain range, and get to Jerusalem. It added such a long time to their trip. But that's how much they were willing to sacrifice in order to stay away from the Samaritans, in order to not even set foot in their territory. They had prejudice that shaped their lives in so many ways. And so the fact that Jesus makes a Samaritan the hero of his story would have shocked his original listeners. In fact, did you notice at the end of the story how the man answers Jesus' question? Jesus asks him, which person do you think was the neighbor to the person who was beat up and needed help? And the answer is clear, the Samaritan. But that's not what the man says. Instead, he answers, the one who had mercy on him. He won't even speak the word Samaritan. He won't say the word. That's how deep the prejudice, the hatred was. Now, you and I, we like to think that we don't have prejudice like that inside of us. We like to think that we don't have any prejudice inside of us. But we do. We all naturally, because of our sinful nature, we separate people into different categories in different camps, for good or for bad. We set up barriers to people who look different than us. Maybe the color of their skin is different, or we don't like the piercings that they choose, or their clothes, or their age. We set up barriers to people who are in a different social class than us. We set up barriers to people who believe differently than us, or vote differently than us, who sin differently than us, until we have a nice, safe little box of people who we like, who we are comfortable with. And we try our best to live inside that little box with those people. It's exactly how the expert of the law who was hearing Jesus' story lived. People in the box, people outside the box. That's how the Samaritan in the story lived too. Because this Samaritan had his own prejudices as well. And this Jewish man sitting by the side of the road, injured and in need of help, he didn't fit inside the Samaritan's approved categories. In fact, that's why the fact that the Samaritan stopped to help him was so stunning. He was traveling on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. He was down in Judea. He wasn't in Samaria. So he was in Judea where there were plenty of other Jewish people who could stop and help this man. A Samaritan shouldn't be the one to have to stop. He had every reason to walk right on past this half-dead victim. After all, he had been on the receiving end of all of his hatred and his prejudices all of his life. But when he saw him in need, Jesus says, he had pity on him. He had compassion for him. He empathized with him. Means his heart felt what that man felt. His heart hurt for this suffering, dying man. And when he was willing to share that pain, suddenly all these categories and all these boxes and all these prejudices didn't matter anymore. There wasn't Samaritan and Jew. The walls that divided them disappeared. And he saw him only as a fellow human being in need. And he loved him as one child of God to another child of God. What would it look like if we learned to love like that? One child of God to another child of God. If we saw every person as a child of God, if we learned to love every single person, no matter their skin color, no matter their political opinion, no matter how much money they have or don't have, no matter if they even deserve our love or not, if we saw every person as someone absolutely loved by God, just like us. That's going to take some work from us. Honestly, that's going to take a lifetime of work from us. We are going to have to break through all the walls of our comfortable boxes, of our comfortable categories, and learn to love all of the people that God places in our lives. When we choose to have compassion for them, when we choose to have empathy for them, then they will begin to experience the love of Jesus through us. You know, it's easy for us to nod and agree with that truth here this morning. It's a lot harder to actually begin to live that truth out in our lives. This story goes so far beyond the be nice, moralistic lessons that we've all learned. In fact, just to see how far beyond it goes, do this for me this morning. I want you to put yourself into this story. Let's say that you are the one lying by the side of the road, injured, beat up, dying. You are desperately in need of someone to help you. That's you. Who is the last person in the world that you would want to come to your rescue? Who is the last person that you would expect to care about you? Who is the last person that you would want to be your good Samaritan? Honestly, I want you to identify that person in your mind. I want you to see their face. Maybe I can help you figure out who that might be. Maybe you can picture the bully or the mean girl in your class who makes you dread going to school. Maybe you'll picture the homeless man who hasn't showered in a month. Maybe you'll picture the white supremacist. Maybe the immigrant. Maybe the person on the opposite side of your political opinion. Maybe you're going to picture a national leader that you disagree with. Maybe you'll picture a friend or a family member who hurt you deeply. And maybe you don't even have a relationship with anymore. That's how deep that hurt has gone. Who is the last person that you would want to be your good Samaritan? Can you picture someone? Now hear the lesson again with that picture in mind. Jesus wants us to tear down the walls that divide us, that cause us to hate each other, or maybe even that cause us just not to care at all about each other. Jesus wants those divisions gone. That's not easy. And we need to be wise about it, but we need to start by recognizing every single person as a loved child of God. God doesn't love me more than he loves them. God doesn't love you more than he loves the person that you pictured in your mind just now. It doesn't matter what they look like or what they believe or how they choose to live or what they've done. They are still absolutely loved by God. And until we see them as Jesus does, until we offer them grace as Jesus has offered us grace, until we follow in Jesus' footsteps and learn to lead with love instead of leading with judgment, until then, we're going to lose our witness to them and to this world. Jesus leads with love, not with judgment, not with indifference, certainly not with hate, and not with prejudice. Jesus leads with love to you and to me. You see, this story is our story. We are the stunning who in this story. Right? While we were still sinners, while we were unworthy, unacceptable, while you and I were offensive to God, while we were the ones beat up and lying helpless by the side of the road, unable to help ourselves, Jesus stopped and he loved us and he gave his everything for us. He laid down his life and he died for us so that we might live. While we were helpless and undeserving of anything, Jesus reached out to us with compassion and empathy and love. And now he says to us that we are to imitate him in our relationships with the people all around us. Jesus led with love in his relationship with you and with me, and I'm so grateful that he did. I'm so grateful that my life mattered to him, that your life matters to him. And that's how he ends his story. He ends his story leaving us with this lifelong challenge. Go and do likewise. Go and love all people, even those you find hard to love, especially those you find hard to love. Love them in my name. Go, do likewise.